Hey there, welcome back. I'm talking to you today about this question, very simple but heavy. Should Christians be willing to say Black Lives Matter? Today I wanted to tell you, first of all, I understand why white people hesitate and conservatives hesitate to say this. First of all, there's very strong emotion around this issue. There's a lack of critical thinking, but there's strong emotion around this issue. And it makes people afraid and hesitant to say that phrase. Secondly, because they are afraid that they will be agreeing with everything that the Black Lives Matter movement or the organization stands for. And I can understand where they're coming from on that. They're also afraid that the other side will just think they're cop haters, like all of those things that go with that. And that they'll be criticized by friends and family for just being cop haters and not having any interest in respecting and caring about the lives of policemen. Additionally, just from the standpoint that it makes for some really socially awkward situations. And I can understand that, I really can. And I do think, though, that Christians should be willing to say, without any hesitancy, Black Lives Matter. Let me tell you why. Here's 6 reasons why I think it's important. Number 1, because it is not considered loving to deflect from specific pain in front of you to general pain. Here's what I mean. I want you to imagine with me that I go as a pastor to the hospital, and I walk into the place where someone from my church has been injured and is recovering from surgery, and I walk in and say, "Man, how you feeling?" And the person says to me, "I'm hurting." And I reply to them, "Well, we're all hurting. We're all hurting. I mean, everyone is hurting. All lives hurt." You feel the awkwardness of that, right? You feel how unloving that would be, right? You know why? Because it is not appropriate. It's not considered loving to deflect from specific pain in front of you to general pain. The same thing would be true if I was at a funeral and I was preaching a funeral and a teenage girl's crying. I just miss my grandma. She mattered so much to me in my life. And I said, well, all grandmas matter. All of them do. Everybody's grandma matters. All grandmas matter. That would not be considered loving. You know why? Because I'm deflecting from specific pain, personal pain, to general pain. Is it true that all grandmas matter? Yes. Is it true that everyone has their own pain? Yes. But it is not considered loving for me to deflect that way. It's not the way I would want to be treated if I was hurting. That's very important that you understand that. It is not the way you would want to be treated if you were struggling with something in this particular way. Let me go to number 2. Number 2, because we should be the first ones to take the first step to understand. I think it's important to understand that the most emotionally mature person in the room should be the first one to take a step to understand what the other person is suffering. So if you view yourself as the most emotionally mature person in the room, you should be that person to take a step first and understand the pain of the other person. Number 3, because it is simple. It is simple. It is not a hard thing to do. Naaman's servant said something really interesting in the story of Naaman in the Bible. He said, if the prophet had asked you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? And I would say, isn't that true, right? If they'd asked you to do some great thing, if they had asked you to go out and walk over broken glass to prove that you love black people, right? What would you do? Well, would you do this? Would you be willing to say Black Lives Matter without quickly covering it with All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter or any other color lives matter? Now, I want you to understand that I'm not saying that blue lives don't matter. If you say Black Lives Matter, you're not saying blue lives don't matter. You're not saying that. You're saying without covering it, Black Lives Matter, because you're dealing with recognizing specific pain in front of you. Number 4, because it's in keeping with the history and theology of Wesleyan peoples. It's in keeping with their history and theology. If you take a look at this, which for some reason my PowerPoint remote is not working, but if you take a look at if you do the research and study, John Wesley wrote a letter to Wilberforce, and he was one of the last letter that we ever have that John Wesley wrote. And he wrote it to encourage him to continue to fight until even American slavery, the worst ever under the sun, he said, is eliminated from the world. In 1842, the Wesleyan Methodist Church left the Methodist Episcopal Church in the South because they were allowing the holding of slaves. And so I want you to understand that we have a proud history in this area, and I'm not calling us by saying, I think we should say Black Lives Matter. I'm not calling us to something new. I'm calling us back to something very old. That is crucial that you understand that. I am not calling you to something new. I'm calling you to something very, very old that is highly, highly part of the heroic history of our movement in fighting against racism and slavery and segregation. Now, I want to tell you number 5. All right, number 5, because it repudiates an evil portion of the history of our country. The idea that Black Lives Matter was not believed. It was not believed by enormous swaths of the American church and in the American public for centuries. And it's important that we repudiate that we help people understand that they personally and the people that they are a part of matter deeply to God. And we say that without having to cover up by saying, but we matter too. We matter too, right? You wouldn't think much of your child's emotional maturity if they were not able to empathize with a person or a group of people in front of them, and without quickly pointing out that they have problems too. You wouldn't think much of that. And I don't think much of it either. And I don't think Jesus thinks much of it either. Now, I'm going to talk about the question of the organization in a minute, all right? So let me briefly survey for you some of the history. Just so you know, the black race was relegated to 3/5 of a person, right? In the compromise, the compromise of slave states joining. So like the census, how do we count people? Southern states wanted to count people count black people as people within the census, but they didn't want to count them as people in terms of giving them rights. The northern states wanted to count people in terms of giving them rights, but they didn't want to count them in terms of the census because they would give the southern states more power. You understand how both sides participated in the dehumanization of the black race. And the 3/5 compromise and this Dred Scott case. Go look these up and study them out. What about continuing on up into the modern era? What about situations where the white church was complicit with the culture and was worldly in its mindset and adopted the mindset of the world in complicity with slavery and racism and segregation? What about all of those situations where the Ku Klux Klan murdered people and many of them were church members at the time? What about that? What about the person who contacted me the other day and said, in my town, the small town that I've driven by, I ran across a Klan meeting with the white hoods and everything just a few months ago? What about that person? Are those people part of a church these days? They could be. Could be. Now, it's a part of our country, a history, an evil part of the history of our country that we should gladly repudiate. Number 6. Because we should refuse to let a non-Christian organization like BLM own a gospel issue. Now, this is where I'm going to get fired up because I think it's appropriate that we get fired up about this. Here's the thing. Black Lives Matter, the organization, has a terrible, terrible agenda. They do. And I repudiate it. I absolutely reject their agenda. That whole section of it is absolutely not right. The whole thing about the destruction of the nuclear family not right. The whole thing about being part and tying them tightly to the movement for stronger gay rights and all of that whole process. No, I repudiate that. I know you do too, and so do I. But here's the thing. You understand that the way morality works is that people find something. We are inherently moral creatures. And so we find something that seems moral and we grab hold of it, and that is moral, and we grab a hold of that. And we anchor our moral sense to those kinds of things. Now here's what Black Lives Matter wants to do. They want to find something that is inherently moral, and we recognize on an extremely gut level that it is moral, that Black Lives Matter. And they tie themselves to that and try to loop in a whole bunch of other things that are not moral and bring them along on the tail of something that is a moral issue. Here's what I'm saying. Black Lives Matter is a gospel issue. It's a gospel phrase. That's a gospel truth. That's a Jesus truth. And I will not allow the organization itself, who stands for a lot of things that are absolutely not gospel and not biblical and absolutely immoral, I won't allow them to own that. They can't have it. It is a gospel territory, and it is the birthright of the people of God. It is Jesus's right to own. And I will not allow them to have it. I want Christians, I am calling for you and me and all Christians to invade that space, invade that issue, and recognize it and say it loudly and proudly and stand up straight with our head held high and say, Black Lives Matter. Yes, they do. Without the need to cover it up and make people feel like nothing else is that we're deflecting from there. You know why? Because if they feel disenfranchised, the Black Lives Matter organization wants to harness the rest of their agenda to the moral sense created by the phrase Black Lives Matter. And they can't have it. They cannot own it any more than the homosexual agenda can own the rainbow. They don't own it. They don't. You know why? Because it's mine. It is God's. It is His territory. It belongs to good news. Because it belongs to good news, I think you and I and all Christians should so flood that moral space that those people become horrified to be identified with us. That they become horrified to be identified with Christians who believe what the Bible says in all areas, not just in the area that Black Lives Matter. And so, yes, I absolutely will say Black Lives Matter. I absolutely would. Do I donate to the organization and its entire goals? No, I do not. Do I believe that Black Lives Matter? Will I say it? Will I argue about it? Will I stand for it? Absolutely, without question. One final note. One of the reasons why it's hard for some people to say Black Lives Matter is because they have not attempted to move toward black Christians and listen to them and hear what matters to them. That's a problem. That's a real, genuine problem. It is easy for you to sit in a primarily or in maybe entirely white church in a predominantly or maybe entirely white neighborhood. Some of them are not that way, but that's another story. It is easy for you to sit inside that comfortable circle of white evangelicalism and throw rocks at people for saying Black Lives Matter and saying and claiming that I and people like me are harnessing themselves to that organization. And I say, no, I'm not. I've loaded my squirt gun and I'm charging the gates of hell, because hell can't have that territory. It belongs to Jesus. It is rightfully belonging to the kingdom of God. And I hope you agree. God bless. Talk to you next time.